I'm Sarah. It's a pleasure to be with you all here today. I just think it says a lot when people give up their Saturday to learn what a bunch of nerds are up to, right? But we're not just nerds. We're here because we're people passionate about places. Today, we're primarily have been talking about Tennessee, but I work nationally. But my roots are tied to Tennessee. For a few years, I had the pleasure of growing up in eastern Tennessee in Harriman. Have any of you actually been there? Maybe? If not, I recommend it. My formative years were spent in a Queen Anne house in walking distance of a Carnegie Library and the beautiful Princess Theater. It's no shock that I would end up working in preservation. So, what has shaped the conversation that we're going to have today is where I have had the pleasure of working to build my fundamental knowledge of what historic preservation is and what it could be. I've had the pleasure of working in two of the oldest designated historic districts in the country. Old Salem Museum and Gardens in North Carolina, which was designated with architectural review in 1948, and the German Village Historic District in Columbus, Ohio, designated in 1960. Both of those predate the National Historic Preservation Act. They are some of the most earliest examples of codifying and creating a preservation movement in a more formal sense. So in order for you to follow along with how I choose to explore historic preservation, let's look at my ever-evolving definition. As a historic preservationist, it's all of you. You are an individual who believes in saving the physical or intangible elements of the past for the betterment of the future. And there are four types of historic preservationists. There's passive preservationists. These are the people who go to the old diner versus Applebee's for breakfast or lunch. They're not really thinking about why they're choosing one place over the other. They just are choosing the older legacy business. There's the active preservationists or recreational preservationists. These people are being unpaid for their labor. They're the volunteers, they're the board members, they're the people who open up their houses for a house and garden tour. They're the people who choose to visit a historic site on vacation. These are the unpaid people who are cognizantly making the choice to engage with the past in some capacity, either as a volunteer or as a tourist or as a homeowner potentially. There's also the professional preservationists, which some of you in the room are, and as well as me. And professional preservationists come in a variety of backgrounds and trainings. Some may have a preservation degree, an archaeology degree, some may have a communications degree. You can be a professional preservationist in a myriad of ways and strategies. And then there's also a fourth type. This is the familial preservationist. This is the one who is the caretaker of the family Bible, like Miss Janine said earlier today. This is the person who is wanting to pass down those stories to the future generations of their family or larger and broader. So as I have been working in preservation for over 15 years now, which time flies, I have really spent a lot of time exploring the past so that we can continue to evolve the preservation movement for the betterment of our communities today. This led me to launching the Dismantle Preservation Initiative. And a lot of people were like, dismantle preservation? What are you doing to us? And I'm like, well, I'm a really literal person. And when I think of dismantling, I'm thinking about my architectural historian training, where I'm looking at the nuts and the bolts of old buildings, of sidewalks, of curbs, of cemeteries. What aspects of those buildings are still viable? Is that wood rotting? Okay, we may need to repair that. Some of the building materials may just be entirely worthless trash that Frank Lloyd Wright dreamed up without talking to an engineer, that we need to entirely rework. So we're dismantling preservation to look at all the layers, to see what is worth keeping in whole, what is worth keeping to preserve or restore in new ways, and then what is worth just leaving maybe in the past. Because after all, we are still using tools that were created in 1966. Do you all know what a computer looked like in 1966? Is that what you want to be using? Probably not. After all of us have a computer in our pocket today. So let's dive in by exploring the past of the historic preservation movement. How the story is told today, if you talk to most historic preservationists, they will tell you it begins with the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. led by Anne Pamela Cunningham in 1853. She led a truly remarkable marketing campaign to acquire George Washington's home to preserve it for future generations. You can still visit it today as a house museum. We have our first national park in 1872, Yellowstone, with the National Park Service established in 1916. If you are not aware, the National Park Service, they're the ones who manage things like the National Register of Historic Places. They are the mothership of historic preservation. We have our first historic district in Charleston, South Carolina. And then in 1966, we have the National Historic Preservation Act, which was passed by Lyndon B. Johnson. So this story is incomplete. It leaves out Acoma Pueblo, the oldest continuously inhabited place in this entire country. Is not their active living and loving and repairing and restoring and inhabiting, is that not preservation? It leaves out concepts explored in the newish book, Historic Real Estate, Market Morality and the Politics of Preservation in the Early United States, written by Whitney Martinko. I highly recommend this to all practicing professionals in the cultural heritage field, because it explores how the earliest Europeans were using the past to capitalize and lure others. Like in Portsmouth, Ohio, along the Ohio River, the native mounds were an integral part of recruiting new colonizers and settlers. So let's explore what preservation looked like from the earliest Europeans. Let's explore what preservation looked like pre-colonization of the country. Preservation has been here since day one. It has been here since people made the intentional choice to record their history on the cliffs in the Southwest and to build the mounds that honored their ancestors. And while Anne Pamela Cunningham was working to save Mount Vernon, she led to and probably helped inspire Adina de Zavala. I highly recommend exploring the work of Adina de Zavala in Texas. She helped save the Alamo. There are songs written about her. Why isn't she in the Texas textbooks that we read? Adina had songs written about her because she didn't just believe in saving the Alamo, she believed in saving extant buildings, those outside buildings around the Alamo that historians who were operating at that time did not find significant. Or if we want to talk about more contemporary preservationists, we can explore Jane Jacobs, and her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, is fairly iconic in the urban planning world, but at the exact same time is Aurora Vargas. Aurora Vargas was fighting to save the Chavez Ravine in Los Angeles. The Chavez Ravine was a Mexican immigrant neighborhood where people were forcibly displaced. She was imprisoned for wanting to stay in her home. Why was this torn down? To construct Dodger Stadium. She was in prison. Jane was in prison. Why do we know Jane but not Aurora? We have to tell and recognize that our history of preservation as we tell it is incomplete. It's incomplete because it does not recognize the impact your grandmas have had, our grandpas have had. We have preservationists in our families. We have preservationists and community advocates who have been working so hard to shape what their communities look like. Let's spend every day we can celebrating those people in our lives today and the people in the past. So all of this history leads us to the National Historic Preservation Act. And that is what creates our standards that we operate with. Remember, we're using standards that were created in 1966. We were still in the space race then, right? Like, this was many moons ago. And some of you may have been there for those beautiful moons and to see it happen, the man on them. But come on, we've all are lifelong learners if you're here on a Saturday. So one of these standards that was set is how we define whether or not something's old or if it's historic. So this is a game we're gonna play. I'm gonna show you an image and you're gonna pretend you're an architectural historian working for a Department of Transportation. You're driving down the road, you're doing a survey, and you have to judge whether or not a building is potentially old or historic. You're doing this windshield survey, as we call them. And these windshield surveys help to determine whether or not a structure or a landscape should be further researched to identify whether or not that road construction project should be modified in any capacity to minimize harm. All right, so this is the kind of gut reaction people are trained for in college We're gonna do this in like 5 seconds. All right, is this old or is it historic? Holler. 3, 2, 1.
Old.
Old. All right, buckle up for this one. Significant, profoundly significant. But the significance isn't necessarily tied to the age of the building. We look at this, and yes, it's a beautiful barn from the 1800s, but it's significant due to the unfortunate murder of Emmett Till. So we are also going to explore in our conversation how an architectural design does not always necessarily indicate whether a place or not is significant. Older, or historic. 3, 2, 1.
Historic.
Well, it's my house. All right, I've researched my house intensely, and it was constructed in the 1920s, the oldest in my neighborhood. There was a photographer who lived there in the 1920s, but yeah, probably not significant really, beyond to me and my beautiful garden and everything that I love about getting to live there and to renovate bit by bit. So, significance, maybe to me, maybe not to the National Park Service. Would you view this as old or historic? 3, 2, 1.
Historic.
Now, I want to hear why you think this is historic. That's what I want to hear for this. Anybody want to say why they view that?
Most squares in traditional towns are important to the area.
Nailed it. So if you look up the historic designation for Mansfield, Ohio, you'll see that the period of significance is tied to the mid-late 1800s when the downtown was originally constructed with the Central Park as a part of the original urban plan. So I was a subcontractor on this project, and I'm someone who really loves 20th century history. So I have a proclivity to dive super deep into that. And when I was diving deep into the park's history, I discovered there used to be restrooms there. And there are no visual clues that would allow you to know there were restrooms in this park. These restrooms were used by the police in the 1960s. The police officers would hide behind mirrors to videotape men doing illegal acts of sodomy at that time. These men were put in prison for their actions. This became a national training program to catch men for sexual encounters and quote-unquote deviant behavior. Is this part of what ended up being part of the period of significance? That's the part of the National Register? No. I was a sub-consultant, so I could only do so much to push hard, but it also helps us to consider the possibilities of what is a period of significance, right? The passage of time is hard to quantify as to what is the most significant aspect of it. Because this building we're standing here today, right? We're in an old jail that became a restaurant, that became a museum, right? Like, people have been engaging in this structure in so many different ways and capacities that the significance cannot be limited to a finite period of time. Whether you view this as significant or not, that can be on you. But let's challenge some things. So is this old or is this significant or historic? 3, 2, 1.
Old.
Well, if you're a person of a certain age, this is really significant. This is where Outcast Dungeon, where they record their albums. You can stay there as an Airbnb now. I highly recommend it. It's super cool. I splurged on it last year. So to me, this is as cool as Elvis's Graceland, which I do love as a tourist. Graceland was incredible. I understood why he was the king after visiting it, and I understood why Outcast is integral to Southern rap history after spending the few nights there, right? So, old, historic, it's really hard to tell from a quick windshield survey, but when we have those opportunities to go to the archives, you can explore why phone booths are significant. I believe it's in either Arkansas or Alabama. There's actually a phone booth on the National Register of Historic Places. The Thompson Center in Chicago, a postmodern marvel building, has been considered eligible for the National Register in Chicago. right? We all find different things historic and significant. You'll even find Barbie's treehouse is eligible for the National Register, at least according to the set designers with their fun little faux marker. So at the end of the day, some of this is subjective, some of it's based on our trainings, but we try and do our best to look and tell the full history. We recognize the stories of everyone are not included in archives. Sometimes it's in family basements, sometimes it's at the church. We have to do our best to look and research to tell the fuller picture so that we can reimagine what our historic inventory forms look like. This is one of my favorite creative writing pieces because I'm a nerd and it's put in an architectural history inventory form. So Barry Grass wrote this about her childhood home. What was the historic use, horror, and refuge? It was wet with booze breath and then verdant with root growth, less desperate than it was decorated. Current use unknown, after Mom passed, the property changed owners. An unfamiliar red truck visible in the driveway on Google Maps, right? I don't know Barry's home. I've never felt like this when I've read an architectural inventory form, but I love the way it shows that it's so much more than a building. It's so much more than what you read in a directory. This is a place that was horror and a refuge for Barry, right? Like, this is a significant site to her, maybe not on the architectural record. So let's just consider significance in a myriad of ways. And we also have to recognize that the work of historic preservation is inherently political, which is tied to some of the subjectivity as to what stories are prioritized to be told. Because some people, no disrespect, but I don't want to hear about the War of 1812. Said as someone who has researched it a lot for a former job. Right? I'd rather talk to you about mid-century modern textiles. So that's where I may lead a tour on, right? But we do our best to tell the full history, to do the full research, and we don't allow ourselves to leave out stories based on bias or other perspectives that devalue War of 1812 over or under the incredible mid-century influence in the home design. So there's significance to it all. So preservation is interwoven into local, state, and national politics. It's interwoven in so many ways. So my last timeline ended with the National Historic Preservation Act. But preservation law helped establish the Historic Tax Credit Program in 1976. The Historic Preservation Fund was established in 1977. That's what helps fund our state historic preservation offices and our tribal historic preservation offices. And it also includes things like the establishment of the Emmett Till and Mammy Till Mowgli National Monument, America's 425th National Park. It also leads to things like in Alabama, you'll find they have a specific grant fund for Civil War sites. But they don't have anything for civil rights sites. That's interesting to explore. How preservation law, how these decisions that our government makes shapes our views of the past and empowers us to have the capability of telling these stories. So let's explore 1976 a bit. So the first historic preservation program, like I mentioned, was co-founded by James Marson Fitch at Columbia in 1964. 1976, though, we get tax credits. We see the real growth. If you look nationally, you see a profound growth in the 1970s of preservation, the professionalization of the movement, the volume of historic designations. You see all of this in part thanks to the bicentennial, the 200th anniversary of the formal establishment of the United States of America. It was an economic boom. You will encounter so many historical societies that were created because of the bicentennial. You'll meet so many buildings that were saved because of the bicentennial. It told a very specific story tied to the Revolutionary War And it really shaped the ways that many people viewed the earliest colonies and what that meant for American history, for better and for worse. And I want us to look to the future together. This is where we get to have a lot of fun right now. 2026. Who knows what's happening in 2026? Do the math. 250th. You've got a national headquarters in Nashville for the American Association for State and Local History. They've put out a program handbook, but we're about to have fun now exploring ideas of how we celebrate moments in time. One of my clients actually has celebrations in their strategic plan. How wonderful is that, right? Like, we are here to celebrate and explore history, the dark history, the good history, and everything in between. Many of us celebrated in 2020 the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote. It is worth noting that was for white women. Not all women or all men could vote until the 1970s. The Voting Rights Act was passed in the 1960s. In the 1970s, there was a court case in Arizona where they were still doing language tests. So I had the pleasure of working with people all over the country, in person and virtually, where we explored the strategies of the suffragists. How did they do an international campaign working across multiple countries to try and advocate for women's right to vote? Not over 1 year, not over 5 years, not over 10 years. This was in the works for many, many decades. So at these workshops, we explored the use of color, the use of verbiage, and people could create banners that were inspired by the past, or maybe they inspired them. I was very amused by the college student doing "woman making man say whoa since forever" banner. We had kids in Utah creating banners just encouraging vote. They have put the state flower on there, and they use the traditional suffrage colors. We had all sorts of ways to encourage people to use the past to be advocates for today. Then this is a banner that I personally made on the right. It's inspired by this banner on the left, which is a part of the Minnesota Historical Society's collection. Mother is the best ever, but is not good enough to vote. That's something that really makes you stop and pause. So I thought a lot about political parity. There's approximately 25 to 28% women in Congress prior to this week's election. I don't know the current stats. So I thought about whether or not mom is the best, but is she good enough to elect? And I was so honored to have this banner on display at the National Women's Hall of Fame this year as a part of a crafting activism exhibit. So, right, like, how do we use the archives to empower people and celebrate moments in time, but not just celebrating the moments in time, but challenging ourselves for what does that mean with where we are in the current world? We say it all the time. The history, right? Like, the history shapes where we are today. So how are we, as people working in cultural heritage, making sure that people are taking the information to be empowered? In Columbus, Indiana, the Bartholomew County Public Library System, I've been celebrating different moments in time with them over the past 5 years. This is an I.M. Pei designed library. If you're not familiar with I.M. Pei, he is an architect who came over to the States in the early mid-1900s during the Asian Exclusion Act. He actually had to show proof that his family had enough money so that he wouldn't be reliant on the government ever. So it was very interesting. I recommend exploring the Asian Exclusion Act. So I.M. Pei designed this library. It's beautiful. It's great. I love going there. So we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the library in 2019. I designed little I.M. Pei dolls. And then we challenged kids to reimagine what sculpture could or should be in front of the library. So we have a famous large arch designed by Henry Moore. And I removed large arch and encouraged them to put there. So this was really fun. We had all sorts of age groups design everything from like SpongeBob's, of course, to things like their own version of the arch. There were a number of young residents who designed open signs. They were like, I can never tell when the library is open. I want an open sign. Some designed outdoor seating areas. So this celebration wasn't just to celebrate how the library has served the community for 50 years, but how we could potentially consider evolving the space to best suit community needs today and ensure it's accessible. This year, we had so much fun celebrating the 100th anniversary of the entire library system. Nothing is cooler than seeing something you designed. The cake maker did versions of the my dolls. It was the coolest. And I helped over 300 people sew in less than 3 hours, sew dolls about Cleo Rogers, the namesake of the library, I Am Pei, Henry Moore the sculptor. There was letterpress, there was live music, there was ice cream. This was such a cool birthday bash for a library system. For a different branch, I designed quilt squares that hallmarked different aspects of time for the library. So these quilt squares I designed, you could use them as a coloring sheet, you could do them for felt applique, or other people use them to actually sew their own quilts, because quilts for the Hope branch are integral to over 100 years of history in the community. So we had a ton of fun. So you can learn how the library used to be in a grocery store. It was also part of like a hardware store at one point. It really evolved over time where it's housed. And then that's just the layout of the square. So the point is, like, arts and crafts is such an incredible, powerful gateway. We see that earlier today with the Parthenon, right? Like, arts helped fuse and connect past to present. Artisans across hundreds and thousands of years, right? So let's continue to explore how we encourage people to engage with sites. As someone who loves visiting historic house museums and going on walking tours, that's not for everyone. Let's consider to explore the ways we celebrate moments in time, big and small, creatively. Have any of you had the pleasure of visiting Manzanar National Historic Site? Okay, this is top 5 historic sites that I think everyone who lives in the United States should visit. So Manzanar National Historic Site is in rural California, and it is the site of a Japanese incarceration camp. If you visit the National Park Service website, they'll call it an internment camp. But as we consider the way we communicate the past, I want us to do it creatively, but I want us to do it accurately. Incarceration camp properly describes the way Japanese citizens and residents during World War II were forcibly displaced from their homes and put in these camps. They were not allowed to leave the camps, they were incarcerated. Internment really softens the language and misconstrues. So when you go to Manzanar, you will learn the stories of resiliency, of how Japanese individuals and families made the best of them being forced to live there and work there. And that included the creation of baseball teams across these different incarceration camps. So if you visit Manzanar today, there's not a ton of physical elements still remaining that are original, but they're slowly restoring the gardens, and the Manzanar Baseball Project has reconstructed the original baseball field. And just last month, they hosted the first baseball game there since the 1940s. How incredible is that? And most of the players were descendants of Japanese incarceration camp victims. How beautiful is that? For them to connect to their family history in that way. I highly recommend looking up this project online. I'll admit, I'm not a huge sports person, but this is art, right? This is beautiful. They handcrafted and hand-built this field. They redesigned their original outfits and paid homage. I know there's a lot of different old-timey baseball teams across the entire country. And how fun is that, right? Like, we have so many ways to connect people over the passage of time. And why not do it through sports? Do it through food, do it through music. Let's be creative and have fun with it. Even if it's difficult history, these men were still out there having fun. And I had some fun a few years ago going back to Old Salem Museum and Gardens. So like I said, they were one of the top 5 oldest historic districts in the country. And that meant they were making some really big preservation decisions about what buildings were considered significant to them. And they landed on the 1700s Moravian buildings, going some into the early 1800s. This super charming building on the left, this brick building, it was built, I believe, the late 1800s, and it's the site of the first Krispy Kreme, right? Huge! Well, those early preservationists didn't think that was significant enough, so they tore it down. All that stands there is this big tree and a little plaque on the ground, like literally on the ground, it's covered in dirt. So I sewed over 100 donuts and hung them from a tree with a banner that says, "Donut Erase History." I did it with permission and everything. But there was nothing more fun than sitting on a bench across the road, watching kids and adults engage with this and understand that the Old Salem Historic District was more than just Moravians. It was also a site of food history that you can still taste today when you see the glazed donut go down the conveyor belt, right? Like, this is significant. I really wonder when I think about what if Old Salem was being preserved today versus the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s when they made this choice. Do you think they would keep the Krispy Kreme? Would they be telling that story? I don't know, but I like to explore that idea, and this was a fun temporary way to do it. And I definitely love exploring temporary ways to tell stories. This summer in Bozeman, Montana, I installed a ton of these very simple yard marker signs. They had archival images on them. One of the sides had a paragraph that explained history, yada yada. It was a way to encourage people to fill out a survey and say how they wanted preservation to be planned in the city. Because they want to explore whether or not they could or should be doing historic markers, all these other things. And then we also hosted a workshop to explore what historic markers could look like. And I just couldn't stop drawing sweet peas. Because sweet peas were this really incredible thread of passage of time in Bozeman. It was tied to their agricultural history. They were shipping sweet peas all over the country. It's tied to a fellowship of Black women. They named themselves the Sweet Pea Club. They were part of the larger Minnesota or Montana statewide colored women's group. So it told stories of farmers and families in Bozeman. And why do we have to stick with the boring historic marker designs? Why can't we let people in the community help design? Because you can come up with so many fun ways to tell stories of the past. Bozeman's already doing it on their trash cans? That's cool, right? Like, that's so simple and easy and straightforward. You can do it on your sewer grates, like in Newark, Ohio. They have the native mounds on there. In New Mexico, you can see the beautiful traditional pottery as the basis for their wayfinding signs. In Granada in Spain, Granada means pomegranate. So you'll find pomegranates on bollards all over town. Like, pomegranate is everywhere, right? So let's consider the ways we tell stories. How do we engage community to help shape the ways we tell stories before we start to install things that are, in theory, permanent? Did any of you see that Dwayne Wade sculpture reveal the other week? Oh, he's a big basketball guy. The sculpture was revealed from him. It did not look like him, right? So, like, how do we best explore the community with how we visually communicate the story to do it well, to do it accurately, to do it in engaging and compelling ways, whether you're doing a more traditional bronze sculpture like Sojourner Truth, On the left, whether you're using elements of the past like the neon sign garden in Casa Grande, Arizona. And also, let's think of these things, all of them, whether it's a historic marker or not, as not necessarily permanent. This is the artist Sandy Williams. He installed this Abraham Lincoln wax sculpture in DC earlier this summer. He sells tiny little candle versions of all sorts of monuments because I think this is what we need to keep exploring. National registers, tours, exhibits, none of them are just done. The work continues. Again and again and again, we continue growing and evolving and updating and amending with our new knowledge, with our growing community. We want to make sure that as we change and evolve our work, that we are doing our best work at making sure everyone sees themselves in the community. No project I've ever done will I look back on and say, oh, that was good. No, nothing I'd change. No, everything I would do, I would change. Today I would change by not painting. But, on a normal situation, usually it's just, oh, here's how I could have better listened to feedback to evolve it. Or, oh, that amendment, that National Register designation, here's how I would research it every 5 years. The California State Historic Preservation Office is on either their third or fourth Latino contact study. They did not do one and call it done. They recognized it has to continue to grow and evolve. So that leads us to why is change slow? Data, cost, fear, and comfort. It's easy to keep telling the same stories. Change is expensive, I get it. And sometimes you need the data to convince your board that it's worthwhile. But when we do change, it has the ability to empower people, to help them feel seen, to help them feel like they can have a voice in how their community is changing and evolving. For them to feel like they have the ability to be the caretaker of their family's archive. There are so many ways for us to continue to explore how to creatively connect people to the past, but we have to do it by recognizing that every day we do this work, we try and do better tomorrow. And our projects that are done, they're never actually done. We keep growing them and evolving them to best serve and evolve. So I love the historic preservation movement. I just think we all need to do a better job at celebrating the fuller, the more complete story, to celebrate all those people who've made an impact then and are making an impact now. So I have some treats for you guys, especially since you really stuck with me today. So I know there's technically an awards ceremony, but you all get awards. So I've been making merit badges this year, and you can get a merit badge for the person who understands people come first, cultivates support systems, and puts their heart into making positive shifts. So you can earn that one today if you want it. Merit badge number 2, you advocate for meaningful change. You amplify the work of others, and you know when to be quiet and listen. And number 3 is you work to change our institutional frameworks. You rewrite the history of historic preservation, and you see preservation as a movement. Pedestals have no place in it. I think it's really important that we recognize and celebrate the labor being done, because we all know, if you're in this room, this labor is coming from passion, honestly. It's from our passion and our belief that it betters communities. And sometimes this is underpaid or undervalued. And sometimes you stand in public meetings and get yelled at. But we've all been there. We do it because we see its benefit. And I want to celebrate you all. You took your Saturday to be here to learn. So you all earned a merit badge of your choice. And if you want, if there's extras, grab one and gift someone to someone you know and who you appreciate their work is. There's no time like the present to give people their flowers. Do it before it's too late. So, questions? Yes?
Okay, so you as a professional in the preservation field, right?
Yep.
I'm assuming you get people asking you for help in lots of different projects. How do you decide what projects to undertake because you probably don't have the kind of resources to do them all?
What kind of resources do they have too? So no, it really varies. Did I take it out of here? So one of my favorite recent projects was a pro bono project that I did. So in Selma, Alabama was the Jackson home. The Jackson home was where Martin Luther King Jr. Would stay prior to the March to Montgomery and after the March to Montgomery. And it was just a space of refuge and safety for planning and organizing the civil rights movement. But I'm sure you've never heard of Richie Sherrod Jackson. So this is it was an incredible site in Selma. And Joanna Jackson is getting up there in age, and I got connected to her, and I partnered with Athena F. Richardson for us to explore what her caretaking plan and legacy looks like for it. And so how did I choose this project, not knowing if there would ever be money in it for me or whatever, is for her, I listened to my heart, I listened to her needs, and Joanna, a proud Fisk graduate, former worker of the Martin Luther King Jr. Center in Atlanta, she was not being taken seriously by people when she was trying to be like, what do I do with my family home that I've been running as a museum on my own for a decade? What do I do before it's too late, before it vanishes? Because I don't know if you've spent much time in Selma, but it is a disinvested community. So I chose that because I assessed my time and my energy, and I felt like I had the ability to help her. And Athena and I actually were able to successfully support her and her long-term vision for the home and its contents as a social justice educational hub. It was acquired by the Henry Ford Museum for Greenfield Village. It was the first home they acquired in over 30 years and relocated from Alabama to Michigan. It is now located near where the structure where Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. It is located near the structure where Abraham Lincoln learned how to practice law. It is located with other sites of social and scientific innovation because the way her family created the support system where the phone calls happened that created the Voting Rights Act, that is profound and impactful, even if you don't know who the Jacksons are. And it's currently being reconstructed, and it will reopen in a couple years and be the first fully virtual house that's a part of Greenfield Village. Pretty cool. So I chose that for a number of reasons. I'm working to be a reformed workaholic as well. Working real hard to not be a workaholic. So I assess my volunteer opportunities by how does it fulfill me in one area. Am I learning from it? Is it personal? And does it help me professionally in some capacity? So personal volunteering that I will always do is pick up litter, right? Like I will happily go to any litter day anywhere. But when I'm asked to join, say, boards or other volunteer activities, I ask them, how many hours am I anticipated to give this month? Am I the right person to be assisting in this manner? How am I going to grow from this? Because sometimes you'll find yourself just like going through the motions and you're like, I'm not growing from this. I want to grow from it. So I think it's important to consider your growth and your time and your energy and your capacity, because what I have found in my work is when I do less preservation work, I do better preservation work. When I spend more time in the garden, I do better time working on reports for my clients. I think it's really important to find that balance and learn when to say yes or no. I've also really worked very hard to cultivate a network who, when I'm not the right person for a project, I can refer to them. Yes, I could do a historic designation for you. I've done them before. It's fine, but that is I know there's a lot of people who are better at writing them than I am because that's what they're most passionate about. The type of work that I'm passionate about right now is creating art activities. I love helping people use their archives and activate them in ways that connect with the community, whether it's pop-up events or long-term tools. I love doing strategic planning. I love looking at the big pieces of the puzzles and putting them together. I think that is so fun. And like one of my clients, I highly recommend looking up the Outsider Preservation Initiative. It's emerged from Dr. Andrea Roberts' Texas Freedom Colonies Project. This initiative is supporting non-traditional preservationists who are working to commemorate the Black diaspora across the country. And I'm helping her use her truly profound research and I'm like putting the pieces together. I'm not the expert in certain areas, but I'm the expert in organizational structures. So some of this has been me doing trial and error, and I've tried so many things in preservation, and some of them are things that I would love to potentially explore again. For a while, I worked on building collections housing for artifacts in collections, and that's really fun. I like building that stuff because I'm a crafty person. But there's other things where I'm just like, I enjoy doing this well enough, but it's not for me, which is okay. And it might just be not for me right now. It might be not for me for forever. So I think it's just being willing to try things, figuring out what your time is, figuring out what your financial needs are, and then figuring out what that whole balance looks like. It's not easy, it's tough, but I think there's so many ways we can work in preservation. And I've done work for everything from fabric companies who wanted to do just like educational programming, to private corporations, to universities and libraries, to all sorts. I find preservation work is so fulfilling when history is not in their mission statement, when they just want to infuse history into a place through whatever strategy. So I'm not sure if that best answers your question, but just really, I think you got to try a lot of things and figure out what does and doesn't make sense. Time, energy, capacity, and make the space for you to reflect and recharge. We can't do the work if we're burning ourselves out. We can't. And I say that to people who are volunteers. I say that to people who are their family caretakers. You can't be doing this if you're burning yourself out.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll take a little break and move on to awards.
Which collect your own awards too.
Yes,
Lots of
course.
celebrations.
Please do.
Awesome. And I do want to say one thing about the Secretary of the Interior standards though, is I highly recommend looking to what is happening in the Arizona. There's some really cool challenges as to what types of designations we do for neighborhoods. How do we reconsider them as cultural areas versus doing things more traditional historic districts. So I think we can use our standards in creative ways. I think we just need to remember to be creative with the ways we use our existing tools. Thank you.